In the spring of 1610, a man named John Rolfe stepped off a ship onto the mud at Jamestown, Virginia, carrying a small packet of seeds he was not supposed to own. The colony he walked into had just finished eating its own dead. The winter they would later call the starving time had taken all but a fraction of the settlers. Of several hundred people, only a few dozen were still standing. The palisade was rotting. The investors back in London had received nothing. No gold, no passage to Asia, no silk, no silver. There was serious talk of abandoning the whole venture and sailing home. And the seeds in Rolfe's baggage were Spanish. Spain guarded its tobacco seed the way it guarded bullion, and selling it to a foreigner was a hanging offense. We still don't know exactly how he got them, or whether he understood what he was risking. He planted them anyway, in the river bottom by the James. 4 barrels of cured leaf sailed for England in 1614. Within a decade, Virginia was planting tobacco in its own streets, because the streets were land, and land was money. Within another decade, the colony was paying its clergy, its taxes, and its debts in dried leaf. And within one more, ships were arriving with people aboard who had been taken specifically to work it. 1 packet of stolen seed. That is the hinge the English-speaking world turns on. Today, about 1.2 billion people buy this plant, roughly 1 adult in 5 alive. It kills more than 8 million of them a year, and around 1.6 million of those never put it in their mouths. They simply stood nearby. It drains something in the order of $1.4 trillion from the world economy annually, close to 2% of everything the human race produces. No war in history has that ledger, and no war has run this long. So how did a weed nobody can eat become one of the most profitable crops ever grown? Why did every ruler who tried to stamp it out end up taxing it instead? And what exactly are you holding when you pull a packet out of your pocket? But this story doesn't begin in Virginia. It doesn't begin with Columbus either. It begins about 8,000 years before any European saw a burning leaf in the foothills of the Andes, where one plant was solving a problem of its own that had nothing to do with us. To understand tobacco, you have to understand one thing first. It is poisonous, and it is poisonous on purpose. Nicotine is not a flavor, and it is not a pleasant additive. It is an insecticide. The plant manufactures it in the leaf as a weapon. A caterpillar that starts chewing takes a dose of neurotoxin, its nervous system fails, and it stops being a problem. This works so well that purified nicotine was sold for decades as an agricultural pesticide. Concentrated, it can kill an adult human being in minutes. But nature has no intentions, only coincidences, and one coincidence here was catastrophic. The nicotine molecule is shaped almost exactly like acetylcholine, one of the main signaling chemicals in the human nervous system, close enough that receptors in the brain accept it as one of their own. It crosses from the lungs into the blood and reaches the brain in roughly 10 seconds, faster than if you injected it into a vein. And there it opens a gate, a pulse of dopamine, a sharpening of attention, a sensation of being clear and collected and slightly lighter than you were. Sit with what that means. A poison invented against insects happened to fit a lock in the human brain. The dose that paralyzes a caterpillar is far too small to kill a person, and exactly the right size to be enjoyed. Then the unpleasant part begins. The brain adapts.
It grows more receptors to compensate for the constant outside signal. And now, without nicotine, the system runs worse than it did before it ever arrived. Pleasure quietly converts into the removal of discomfort. The person is no longer smoking to feel good. They are smoking to stop feeling bad. The loop closes in a matter of weeks. This is why tobacco's story looks nothing like the story of spices or sugar. Spices were wanted. Tobacco made demands. And it is why every decree, every execution, every mutilation you are about to hear broke against the same wall. A king could sentence a man. He could not sentence the man's receptors. This was never a war on a fashion. It was a war on chemistry, fought by people who had no word for any of it. The first humans to find that chemistry were not Europeans. And unlike Europeans, they treated it with something close to fear. Tobacco comes from South America, from the country where the Andes drop away toward the lowlands, somewhere across what is now Peru, Bolivia, and northern Argentina. People were using it at least 6,000 to 8,000 years ago, and cultivating it around the time the Old World was domesticating wheat. From there it traveled north, through Amazonia, through Central America, out to the Caribbean, up the eastern woodlands to the Great Lakes and the forests of Canada. By the time Spanish sails appeared, tobacco grew nearly everywhere anything grew, and nearly everywhere it was neither food nor merchandise. It was a way of speaking to what could not be seen. Among the Maya, smoke was literally conversation. Carved reliefs at Palenque show priests with smoking bundles. The smoke that rose was understood to go to the gods and come back as an answer. The word behind our own cigar traces to a Mayan root for smoking. Tobacco was burned on altars, dissolved in water, chewed, blown through reeds. A shaman putting himself into a trance used doses that would have flattened an ordinary person. And that was not abuse, it was a professional skill. Among the Aztecs, tobacco attended power. Pipes were buried with the nobility. Smoke was present at receptions and agreements. Spaniards, who later described Moctezuma's court, noted that after a meal, scented smoking tubes were brought out, not as an indulgence, but as part of the ceremony. And here's the part that matters most. Everywhere it was used, it was rationed by occasion. It was tied to an event, a rite, an illness, a treaty. It would not have occurred to anyone to do it all day, every day, for no reason. That would have been like proposing to attend church 20 times before dinner. Europe would not break the plant. Europe would break the frame around it. Further north, in the woodlands, tobacco had become something stranger still to the European mind. It had become a legal instrument. I mean the calumet, which entered our languages as the peace pipe. And that translation has done real damage, because it makes people picture a friendly gesture. It was a procedure. A long pipe with a carved stone bowl and a decorated stem was understood to carry authority of its own. It was smoked when alliances were made, when a stranger was taken into a community, when a war was ended, when land was discussed. Who touched it, in what order, which way the smoke was directed, all of it carried meaning, the way signatures and seals carry meaning. To breathe the same smoke was to enter a shared obligation. Breaking an agreement seal that way was heavier than breaking your word. Hold on to this, because it explains almost everything that follows. To the peoples of the Americas, tobacco was a thing that could not be bought, because it was about relationship rather than exchange.
Within 120 years, the same leaf would be currency, wages, taxes, debts, all settled in it. No commodity in history has ever made that turn from sacred to spendable so fast. But before that could happen, somebody had to fail completely to understand what he was looking at. Early November, 1492. Columbus's ships lie off an island he believes is the edge of Asia. A small party has gone inland to look for the Great Khan, for gold, for cities roofed in precious metal. Two men lead it, Rodrigo de Jerez and Luis de Torres, brought along as an interpreter because he knew Hebrew and Arabic and was expected to address an Eastern court. They found no court, no gold either. They found people carrying smoldering bundles of dried leaf, drawing the smoke in and letting it out through their noses. The Spanish priest Bartolomé de las Casas, working later from the expedition's records, described the scene almost helplessly. The islanders had firebrands and dried herbs rolled in a leaf, lit at one end and drawn at the other. He reached for the only comparison he had, a paper tube of the kind children made for feast days. The Spaniards stood and watched, understanding neither the purpose nor the point. Of the whole crew, one man was genuinely taken with it. Rodrigo de Jerez brought the habit home to Spain, and when his neighbors saw smoke coming out of a man's mouth, they concluded he was possessed because they had no other available explanation. The Inquisition agreed with them. He went to prison for years, and by the time he came out, half his country was doing it. But Las Casas wrote down something sharper than any of that. Watching both the islanders and the Europeans who had picked up the habit, he noted that once a man started, he could not leave it off, even when he was reproached for it. That is the first written description of nicotine dependence in human history, from a friar with no word for receptor and no concept of dopamine, 4.5 centuries early. Nobody listened to that part. They listened to something else entirely. Because 16th century Europe was dying of everything at once. Plague came in waves. Syphilis was working its way across the continent. Infant death was ordinary, and medicine rested on 4 bodily humors and a bleeding bowl. Into that world arrives a plant from the New World that visibly, immediately, does something to a person. The head clears, pain recedes, the state of you changes. In a society where almost no remedy works at all, a substance that noticeably works at anything becomes a miracle by default. In 1571, the Seville physician Nicolás Monardes published his study of the medicinal riches of the New World, and in it, tobacco is close to a universal cure. Headache, toothache, coughs, asthma, colic, worms, burns, wounds, ulcers, snake bite. Leaves were laid on cuts, smoke inhaled, decoctions drunk. The book was translated and reprinted across Europe. A quarter of a century later, the Netherlands produced a volume with the wonderfully unambiguous title of The Herb Panacea, starring the same plant. What the thing needed in France was simply good publicity. It got it. Jean-Nicot de Villemain, French ambassador at the Portuguese court in Lisbon, sent seeds and leaves back to Paris with a recommendation: good for migraines. Catherine de Medici suffered from migraines, and Catherine de Medici was a woman whose approval moved French court fashion faster than any edict. It was brewed for her, ground for her, given to her to inhale, and by her own account, it helped. What follows is what always follows when a queen approves of something. Snuff became compulsory equipment at court.
The plant was given an honorific name after the ambassador, Nicotiana. And 2.5 centuries later, when chemists isolated the active compound in the leaf, they named it the same way. Nicotine is the surname of a French diplomat who never smoked in his life and was entirely convinced he was doing Europe a favor. The word tobacco itself came earlier and is murkier. The Spanish took it from the Arawakan peoples of the Caribbean, but what it meant in Taíno is still argued over. The pipe or reed used for inhaling, or the roll of leaves, or the rite itself. Europe, as usual, carried off the word and left the meaning behind. England came late and then went further than anyone. The leaf reached English hands in the 1560s, and by the last quarter of the century, London had a genuine craze. Sir Walter Raleigh made pipe smoking a mark of the fashionable courtier. There's a much-repeated story of a servant hurling a tankard of ale over him in the belief that his master was on fire, and whether or not it happened, the fact that Elizabethans found it funny tells you the habit was new enough to be startling and common enough to joke about. Tobacco houses opened. Men paid for smoking lessons, actual instruction in how to hold the pipe and shape the exhale, because the point was never the tobacco, it was being seen doing it correctly. Clay pipes were made by the thousand with bowls the size of a thimble because the leaf was still expensive enough to be measured out in pinches. And in 1603, a man came to the English throne who found all of this repulsive. James I hated tobacco personally and viscerally. In 1604, he did something no monarch had done before. He wrote a pamphlet. A counterblast to tobacco is a king setting out, in print, exactly what disgusts him. A custom loathsome to the eye, hateful to the nose, harmful to the brain, dangerous to the lungs, and in its black, stinking fume, nearest resembling the smoke of the bottomless pit. Set the period style aside and look at the list. The brain, the lungs, and separately, the people forced to breathe it near you. In 1604, the King of England named the lungs and secondhand smoke 3.5 centuries before the first epidemiology. Not because he knew anything, because he found it revolting. Sometimes disgust arrives before evidence. But James was not only a moralist, he was a monarch with an empty treasury. And the year after the pamphlet, he made his second move, which mattered vastly more than the first. He raised the import duty on tobacco by a factor that contemporaries could only describe as astonishing, from pence a pound to shillings a pound. This is the pivot of the entire story, and it usually goes unnoticed. He did not prohibit, he priced. James was the first ruler to ask the different question, not how do I stop this, but how much can I take from it? The answer turned out to be so satisfactory that within a few decades, the English crown would be defending the tobacco trade with the same energy its founder had spent condemning it. Those who took the other road, stop it at any cost, ran one of the cruelest and most futile campaigns of state violence on record. Istanbul, 1633. A man in plain clothes is walking the night streets, the kind of man nobody looks at twice. He stops outside a coffee house, breathes in, moves on. This is Sultan Murad IV, and he is hunting. He had taken the throne as a boy in an empire chewed up by mutiny and palace conspiracy, and he spent his life imposing order by the only method he trusted. In 1633, after a great fire in the capital, he banned tobacco outright, along with coffee and wine. One penalty? Death. And he did not leave enforcement to subordinates. He went out to check personally, in disguise, and sentence was carried out where the offender stood. Contemporaries and later chroniclers wrote of something like 15 to 20 executions a day. There are accounts of him catching men smoking on campaign, in the field, between battles. The result? The trade did not stop. It went underground and got more expensive. People smoked in cellars, in bathhouses, in tents, at night. And when Murad died and his brother took the throne, the prohibition was lifted, and tobacco was immediately taxed. The same script ran everywhere. In Persia, under Shah Abbas, tobacco sellers were tortured and maimed. In Japan, the shogunate issued decree after decree, and each new decree is proof the last one failed. In Rome, a pope excommunicated people for taking snuff in church, and a century later the papal state was running a tobacco manufactory of its own. And there was Russia, where it took its own thorough form. After the Great Moscow Fire of 1634, blamed on smokers, the ban went total. No keeping it, no selling it, no using it. The Law Code of 1649 then fixed the punishments in writing, in that flat administrative tone that makes it worse. Men brought in twice or three times with tobacco were to be tortured more than once, flogged, and for repeat offenses to have their nostrils torn and the noses cut off. Think about what that means in practice. The man was marked. A cut nose is not a sentence that ends. It is a permanent caption on your face, visible to every stranger for the rest of your life. They smoked anyway, and half a century of it ended with one signature. Peter the Great picked up the habit on his tour of Europe, in England, where everyone smoked everywhere. He was no reformer on this question. He was a customer who happened to be a monarch. In 1697, he legalized open sale, then signed an exclusive contracts to import English leaf. Here is the lesson of that century, and it will repeat. Prohibition failed everywhere, always, at every level of brutality, from the lash to the block. Not because these rulers were weak, because they were fighting a habit while the actual opponent was a receptor nobody knew existed. The other road worked flawlessly. Tobacco turned out to be the perfect thing to tax. Demand barely falls when the price rises, consumption is regular, and the product is easy to count and control. A state that taxes tobacco gets what every treasurer dreams of, a dependable income stream drawn from dependents. So an alliance forms that has never since broken. The state stops being tobacco's enemy and becomes its business partner. Which left one question: where to grow the stuff? And the answer would turn a half-drowned English colony into the foundation of a future superpower. We left John Rolfe planting stolen seed in the mud at Jamestown. Now watch what grows out of it. The native tobacco the English found in Virginia, the crop the Powhatan grew, was dark and harsh to their palate. The mild, sweet leaf came out of the Spanish colonies, which is precisely why Spain guarded the seed. Rolfe's smuggled variety went into the rich bottomland by the river, and he learned curing and drying from the Powhatan themselves, from the very people whose land this crop was about to swallow. By 1612, he had a working crop.
In 1614, the first 4 barrels sailed.
London took them for Spanish. Within 3 years, exports were running into tens of thousands of pounds of leaf. And Virginia lost its mind. Tobacco went in everywhere, in gardens, between the houses, in the streets of Jamestown, literally in the roadway, because ground is ground. Governors had to issue orders compelling colonists to plant a minimum of corn, or men busy with the profitable leaf would have starved to death in the middle of a boom. Tobacco became money, not as a metaphor, but as a fact. Clergy were paid in it. Taxes and fines were settled in it. Debts were cleared in it. Land and labor were priced in it. When the Virginia Company began shipping women to the colony so the settlers would form households, a bride's passage was reckoned at a fixed weight of tobacco, and the figure was written down in the records. Remember the calumet? The plant that could not be traded because it was about relationship rather than exchange? 120 years later, the price of a wife was written on it. And here the story stops being about commerce. It becomes about people turned into equipment. Tobacco is a crop that eats hands, not a seasonal surge like grain, but constant, meticulous, brutal manual work almost all year. Seed beds, transplanting, topping, suckering, picking leaf by leaf, curing, sorting, packing. One worker can manage only a very limited acreage, which means profit runs into exactly one constraint: how many people you can put in the field without paying them. In August 1619, a ship reached Point Comfort on the Virginia coast, carrying Africans taken from a Portuguese vessel. They were traded for provisions. It is the first documented arrival of enslaved Africans in English North America. They were landed where hands were needed for tobacco. After that, the system builds itself, decade by decade. Indentured servants out of Europe first, then statutes making bondage lifelong and hereditary and attached to skin. Then a plantation economy stretched across the whole American South. Sugar would take the model to the Caribbean, and cotton would industrialize it in the 19th century. But the first crop the English colonies assembled it for was the tobacco leaf. The same leaf that, on that same continent, a century earlier, had been smoked to bind peace between nations. While that system was setting in the colonies, tobacco in Europe was traveling the opposite way, out of vice and into refinement. The 18th century belongs to snuff. Smoking a pipe in polite company came to look coarse, common, soldierly. The aristocracy switched to powder, a pinch on the back of the hand, a short, sharp inhalation, a practiced gesture, a lace handkerchief. And around that gesture grew an entire industry of status, the snuff box. Gold, enamel, miniature portraits on the lid, stones around the rim. It became the diplomatic gift of the age, handed to ambassadors, awarded for services, used to settle obligations. Napoleon owned dozens. Some were worth more than a village produced in a year. Notice this because it happens twice more. Every time tobacco starts to feel too cheap, too common, somebody finds a way to put the price back. A new ritual, a new object, a new package. The plant is not what costs money. What costs money is everything wrapped around it. And all through this, medicine still considered tobacco a cure. It applied it in ways best learned sitting down. London, late 18th century. Along the Thames, at the busy points near the bridges, cases of medical equipment were mounted for public use. the defibrillator cabinets of their day, placed there by a society dedicated to reviving the drowned. The city sat on a river. People went into it constantly, and how to bring back a body pulled out of the water was a practical question. Inside the case, bellows, tubes, and a supply of tobacco. The method was considered advanced. The reasoning was tidy. The drowned man is cold and slack, so he needs warmth and stimulation. Tobacco smoke supplies both, and it will be absorbed fastest if introduced where absorption is fastest. The smoke was blown into the rectum. There was a reward for performing the procedure. It was written up in manuals. People were trained in it. It was credited with saving lives, and in some cases it probably coincided with one. A man is hauled out, rubbed, jostled, and shouted at, and comes round on his own. This went on for decades, until in the early 19th century, somebody established the obvious. At that dose, nicotine does not stimulate the heart, it depresses it. The treatment was, if anything, finishing the job. What survives of the practice is a phrase. When we say somebody is blowing smoke at you, we mean they are flattering you with something that isn't true, and almost nobody using the expression knows where it came from. The idiom outlived the medicine by 200 years. Sit with how precise that is as a symbol. A plant treated with the very thing it damages. A rescue that killed. Total confidence resting on nothing, defended by authority. A century and a half later, the whole shape of it returns, only with a doctor in a white coat in a magazine advertisement. The real turning point, though, came in 1839 in a curing barn in North Carolina at night, entirely by accident, and the man who caused it did not legally own his own name. After harvest, tobacco has to be cured, and the method decides everything: color, strength, flavor. Leaves were hung in sheds over a slow wood fire, and what came out was dark, strong, heavy leaf, whose smoke could not be pulled deep into the chest. The throat refused it. That night, a young enslaved man named Stephen was minding the fire. One account says he fell asleep. Another says the fire simply burned low. To bring the heat back fast, he threw charcoal on it. The heat came up hard and dry, nothing like the usual slow smolder. In the morning, the leaf in that barn was not brown. It was gold. They called it bright leaf. It was milder, sweeter, and, here is the thing that matters, its smoke could be drawn into the lungs without choking, which meant nicotine no longer had to seep slowly through the lining of the mouth. It went across the enormous surface of the lungs and reached the brain in seconds. Hold on to this detail. It outweighs every decree and every king in this story combined. The cigarette as we know it became possible right here. Dark tobacco was smoked. Bright leaf could be inhaled. The distance between those two verbs is the distance between a habit and a dependency. The technique spread through the region, and then a war spread it everywhere. During the American Civil War, soldiers from both armies passing through North Carolina acquired the taste and carried it home with them. When the fighting ended and they scattered, orders arrived from every state in the Union. A brand named for the town of Durham became one of the first genuinely national products in America. The man it started with received nothing. We do not know his surname or what became of him. The industry built on his accident would be counted in billions of units within 50 years. All that remained was learning to make them fast. The cigarette itself was not a European idea. Thin paper tubes of shredded leaf were made in Spanish America, came from there to Spain, and were picked up by Turks and Russians. In the middle of the 19th century, in the Crimea, British and French soldiers in the trenches watched their enemies and their allies smoke. Not a pipe that has to be packed, cleaned, and protected, but a quick paper roll, finished in minutes and thrown away. For a soldier, it was perfect. For industry, it was better than perfect. One bottleneck remained. Cigarettes were rolled by hand. A skilled worker managed a few hundred a day, and that ceiling capped everything. In the early 1880s, a young Virginian inventor named James Bonsack patented a machine that formed a continuous rope of tobacco, wrapped it in a ribbon of paper, and cut it into equal lengths. The first versions jammed, tore, and misbehaved. They were fixed. And here is the number worth stopping for. One machine did the work of dozens of people and turned out well over 100,000 cigarettes a day. Production became effectively unlimited. The problem instantly inverted. The shortage was no longer hands. It was smokers. The man who solved that was James Buchanan Duke. He was among the first to install Bonsack machines. He drove his unit cost through the floor, and he poured the savings into something the tobacco trade had barely touched: advertising. Posters, collectible picture cards inside the pack which children hoarded and pestered adults for, free samples, payments to shopkeepers for prime shelf position, sponsorship. Duke bought competitors until his trust controlled the overwhelming majority of the American cigarette market, until the government broke it up under antitrust law and scattered it into the companies that would define the industry for the next century. This is where the modern cigarette is actually born, not as a way of smoking, but as a mass market product with a brand, a package, a slogan, and an image of the sort of person who chooses it. Then the wars arrived and finished the job. The First World War is the moment the cigarette became normal. It went into the ration. Charities handed it out and considered the act a mercy. Requesting supplies from Washington, the American commander in Europe put tobacco on the same line as ammunition. On his reasoning, the army could not fight without it. The mechanism was simple and merciless. Millions of young men who had never smoked were handed free cigarettes under conditions of fear, boredom, and sleeplessness. In other words, exactly when nicotine is most persuasive. A few years later, they went home as customers, permanently. The Second World War ran the same play on a larger stage on both sides of the line. Cigarettes went into rations and into relief shipments, and in the wreckage of post-war Europe, a pack of American cigarettes was for a while more reliable than any local currency. It bought food, favors, and paperwork. Tobacco was money again, exactly as it had been in Virginia 300 years earlier. But the industry still had an untouched market twice the size of its existing one. Half of humanity barely smoked because a woman smoking in public was considered vulgar. In 1929, that wall came down in a single staged photograph. A tobacco company hired Edward Bernays, a public relations man, a nephew of Sigmund Freud, and effectively the inventor of the modern industry. Bernays did not advertise cigarettes to women. He did something cleverer. He arranged for a group of young women to join the Easter parade in New York. At an agreed signal, they produced cigarettes and lit them together in front of the crowd and in front of photographers who had been invited in advance. It reached the press not as an advertisement, but as news, a story about women claiming equal ground. The cigarettes in their hands were christened Torches of Freedom. The whole country discussed it the next morning. Within a few years, women smoking had stopped being a scandal and become a fashion, and the market doubled. Consider what happened there. Not one word was said about the taste, the quality, or the price of the product. He wasn't selling a cigarette. He was selling a feeling of independence to people who genuinely didn't have enough of it. The 30s, 40s, and 50s were the golden age. A cigarette in the hand of every character on screen. Cigarettes on posters held by athletes and film stars. And most remarkable of all, cigarettes in advertisements where a man in a white coat with a stethoscope looks out at you, and the copy explains which brand his colleagues prefer. Doctors recommended cigarettes. That is not an exaggeration or a joke. Those advertisements ran in mass-market magazines and in medical journals, too. The trouble was that around the same time, a handful of doctors nobody was paying began noticing something extremely unwelcome. Before the 20th century, lung cancer was a rarity. So rare that a professor might see 1 or 2 cases in a career and present them as curiosities. By the 1930s, physicians on both sides of the Atlantic were remarking that the ward suddenly had an indecent number of them, and that nearly all the patients smoked. The first problem was that nearly everybody smoked. The second was the delay. 2 or 3 decades passed between the first cigarette and the diagnosis, so the curve of consumption and the curve of disease do not run alongside each other. They run a generation apart. To see the link, you could not observe. You had to count. Several papers appeared, and 2 of them changed everything. In May, in the United States, Ernst Winder and Everett Graham published their study. In September, in the British Medical Journal, came the paper by Richard Dahl and Austin Bradford Hill. The method was direct. Compare the smoking habits of lung cancer patients with those of patients in the same hospitals, matched for age and sex, admitted for something else. The gap was far too wide to be chance. One personal detail says more about their honesty than any argument could. Richard Dahl began the work as a smoker. He expected the culprit to be city air or tar from the roads. When the data said otherwise, he stopped smoking before his own paper was even published. Then Dahl and Hill took the step that turned suspicion into proof. They posted questionnaires to tens of thousands of British doctors and began following them, properly, patiently. The British doctors' study ran for 50 years. Doctors were chosen deliberately. They answer questionnaires. They are easy to trace through the register, and their causes of death are recorded accurately. The interim results in the mid-50s were already unambiguous. The final ones were devastating. Lifelong smoking cost roughly 10 years of life on average. Around half of persistent smokers died of causes connected to it, and those who quit recovered a substantial share of what they'd lost. The more, the earlier they stopped. In January 1964, the Surgeon General of the United States walked into a press room with the report of his advisory committee. They deliberately chose a Saturday, hoping to soften the hit to the stock market. It didn't help. The report named smoking as a cause of lung cancer and the chief cause of chronic bronchitis, and put the death rate among smokers far above that of non-smokers. One of the men involved remembered afterwards that it hit the country like a bomb. Front pages, every radio station, every television channel. The following year, Congress required a warning on the pack. A few years after that, cigarette advertising came off American television and radio. You would think that was the end. It wasn't. Because long before the report, the industry had built a weapon that scientific evidence is almost powerless against. December 1953, a hotel in New York. Behind closed doors, the heads of the major tobacco companies meet, competitors who in ordinary life would not have shared a table. The occasion, the research of the past few years and the first popular articles about tar. With them sits the head of a leading public relations firm. The decision taken in that room was, in its way, brilliant. Do not argue with the science. Do not attempt to refute specific papers. Do not claim cigarettes are safe. Claim the question is still open. In January 1954, a joint statement from the tobacco companies ran in hundreds of American newspapers. The tone is a model of responsibility. Public health comes first. The evidence is disputed. Science must settle it. And we, for our part, are founding and funding a research committee to find the truth. The committee was real. It really did fund research, for years, generously, and largely the kind that pointed elsewhere. Genetic predisposition, air pollution, stress, personality type. The product of that machine was not cigarettes. It was doubt. The mechanics are simple and still in use across other industries today. Persuading someone to start smoking takes enormous effort. Persuading them not to quit takes one sentence. The scientists are still arguing. A smoker who wants to smoke will pick that sentence up himself and be grateful for it. Running alongside it was a second line, selling not safety, but the sensation of safety. Filters arrived, presented as protection, though the real effect was modest. Light and mild varieties arrived, where the lower numbers were achieved partly through tiny ventilation holes in the filter that a testing machine leaves open and a human mouth covers with lips and fingers, compensating with deeper draws. On paper, the figures fell. In the lung, they did not. Meanwhile, inside the companies, people were writing the documents that would become the decisive evidence 40 years later. Internal discussions of the pharmacology of nicotine, of what actually holds a customer, of the product's appeal to the young, of ways to manage how much of the active compound is delivered. April 1994, a congressional hearing. 7 chief executives of the largest tobacco companies stand in a row, raise their right hands, swear an oath, and one after another state that they do not believe nicotine is addictive. That footage played for decades afterwards. It became a symbol, not because anyone went to prison, but because at almost the same moment those internal papers began coming out, and they flatly contradicted what had been said under oath. After that, it collapsed quickly. States that had spent years paying to treat smokers out of public budgets sued. In 1998, the Master Settlement Agreement was signed. The companies would pay the states enormous sums, hundreds of billions of dollars scheduled across decades, abandon whole categories of marketing, dissolve the industry bodies that had manufactured the doubt, and open their archives. Millions of pages of internal documents became public. Historians and lawyers are still working through them. And in 2003, the World Health Organization adopted the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control, the first treaty of its kind in its history, in force from 2005. Excise taxes, advertising bans, package warnings, smoke-free premises, help for those quitting. Most of the world's countries signed. For the first time in 500 years, humanity had a tool against tobacco that was neither the block nor the lash. The only question was where the market had moved to by then. It had moved to places where nobody had ever heard of a Surgeon General's report. Here is the central figure of the present day, and it explains everything else. The number of tobacco users worldwide really is falling, from roughly 1.38 billion at the start of the century to about 1.2 billion by 2024. The progress is real, and it was paid for with decades of work by doctors, lawyers, and legislators. But tobacco still has 1 adult in 5 on this planet. More than 4 in 5 of those users are men, and the overwhelming majority live in low and middle-income countries where regulation is thinner, excise duties are lower, and the industry's marketing budgets land on a local market with roughly the force they had on America in the 1920s. The scheme hasn't changed since the 17th century. Only the geography has. Where a market closes, the company moves to one that is still open. And the bill reads like this. More than 8 million deaths a year, about 1.6 million of them people who never smoked and were simply in the room. Something in the order of $1.4 trillion a year in direct and indirect losses, comparable to 2% of world output. And roughly half of persistent smokers die of it. Not some abstract elevated risk, but a coin toss stretched across 30 years. The Second World War, across all its years, killed fewer people than tobacco kills in a decade of peace. The industry, meanwhile, has not gone anywhere, and it has got smarter. For 20 years, its main move has not been to defend the cigarette, but to lead the retreat from it. Vapes, heated tobacco devices, nicotine pouches tucked under the lip, flavor liquids in flavors no adult would think to ask for. All of it is presented as harm reduction, and there is some truth in that. For an adult smoker who will not otherwise quit, switching may genuinely be the lesser evil, and some regulators accept as much. But look closely at what is actually being sold. Not tobacco, nicotine. The same molecule that started as a plant's defense against caterpillars, now separated from the leaf, from the smoke, from the smell, from the whole inconvenient history, and packaged in a glossy object the size of a memory stick that doesn't stink, doesn't stain your fingers, and doesn't look like a dependency. A good many of the teenagers who arrived at it had no habit whose harm needed reducing. They had zero. Now they have receptors. 500 years ago, the product was a leaf. 300 years ago, a pinch of powder in a gold box. 100 years ago, an image of freedom in a paper tube. Today, a device that tastes of mango. Everything changes except the molecule. And there are 2 lines on the bill that hardly get mentioned. The first is filters. Cigarette butts are the most common piece of litter on Earth, found on beaches and in storm drains more often than plastic bottles and bags. The filter, sold as a piece of health care, is made of cellulose acetate and takes years to break down, shedding microplastic along with everything it absorbed on the way. The estimates of how much water a single butt contaminates sound absurd until you multiply them by
trillions of butts a year. The second is the people who grow the leaf. Tobacco is still picked by hand, and a worker moving through wet leaves all day absorbs nicotine straight through the skin, a condition called green tobacco sickness, with nausea, weakness, and dizziness. On plantations in a number of countries, some of those workers are children. Forest has been cut for centuries to fuel curing barns, and in some regions it still is. A person who never smokes a single cigarette still pays part of this bill in cleared forest, fouled water, and somebody else's health. That is the real conclusion of these 500 years. Power over this plant has not gone anywhere. It has only changed hands. Once it sat with a sultan walking his own capital at night deciding who would live. Then with a tsar signing an order about noses. Then with a crown that found it profitable for you to smoke. Now it sits in a marketing department where people work out what flavor appeals to a 16-year-old and what a device should look like so that it does not look like a cigarette. Nobody orders you to smoke anymore, and nobody forbids it on pain of death. It is simply explained to you very carefully that you are making a free choice. Look back down the whole road at once. A plant that invented a poison so it wouldn't be eaten. Peoples who decided that poison was the language of the gods and smoked it to seal peace. A sailor jailed because smoke came out of his mouth. A queen who treated her migraines with it. A sultan who took heads for it. A czar who took noses. A colony saved from extinction by it. A ship carrying people brought in to pick it. A man with no surname who left a fire too long. A machine making 100,000 an hour. Women lighting up at an Easter parade in the name of liberty. A doctor in a white coat on a poster. 7 men with their right hands raised, saying something untrue under oath. All of that is the history of one leaf a human being does not even need. You cannot eat it. It does not feed you, heal you, warm you, or build anything. It gives you nothing at all, except 10 seconds between the draw and the brain. And that was enough to build fortunes, empires, laws, and cemeteries. Remember that the next time you walk past a shop and see the neat rows of identical packets behind the glass. Remember that 500 years of calculation are standing behind each one. Remember that men were once executed for exactly what is now sitting there with a price on it. Remember that somebody still pays for it, just not the person collecting the money. And the next time you catch that familiar smell drifting across a bus stop, hold still for a second. What you're smelling isn't tobacco. It's the most stubborn habit in human history, the one that outlasted the block, the lash, the science, and the law. If you made it this far, subscribe. There are a lot more stories like this coming. And tell me in the comments which moment got you most. The peace pipe that became currency, the hotel room where they decided to sell doubt, or the Easter parade in New York. I genuinely want to know which one landed.